All right, hello everybody and welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's call. We're so happy you're here. This is the ESRD Learning and Action Network series focusing on bloodstream infections. This is Stephanie Hall with the NCC and I'll be your host for today. Let me go over a few reminders before we get into the presentation. We are streaming this audio via the internet. There's no telephone lines that are required. And that's to help free up lines in your facilities as well. And if troubleshooting, if you're hearing any echoing, that's caused usually by multiple connections to a single event, so please close all but one of your browser tabs. All the phone lines are muted. We do want to hear from you though, and we ask that you please put a request in the Ask a Question box located on the lower kind of left-hand side of your screen. And for any other audio troubleshooting issues today, the audio from your computer speakers, if they're breaking up, you can hit F5, it's on the top row of your keyboard, or click the refresh button on the top bar of your computer. As I mentioned, when submitting questions today, type the questions in Ask a Question section located in the left-hand side of your screen. We do want to hear from you. We are going to have time for questions and answers at the end of this presentation, so please submit them for we're going to have two presenters today. If you could, it would be helpful if you could, in your question, please direct which speaker the question is for. That would kind of help when we come into that question and answer time. And reasons for participating in today's call. We're going to learn today how comorbidities impact surgical access for our dialysis patients. And ways to spread the best practices from today's call. We're going to listen and share approaches and your experiences via the chat. We're going to identify how shared information could be used at your facility. And we're going to ask that you apply at least one idea from today's LAN call at your facility, something that you've learning today that you can take back to your facility and implement to help reduce the bloodstream infections. Before we get into our speakers, I do want to just share with everybody the pre-work questions that was sent out. And we had 724 people respond to our pre-work questions. So thank you for everybody who took time to do those questions. The first question was, does your facility use a tracking tool to monitor patients as they move through the process of an AVF or an AVG placement? And I'm kind of happy to say overwhelmingly 93% of the participants said yes, they do, and only 7% said no. So that's great to hear. The second question was, does your facility ever consider comorbidities when creating a surgical plan for vascular access? Again, out of the 724 respondents, 654 said, or 90% said yes, they do, and almost 10% said no, they do not. So again, that's very pleasant to see. Very happy to see that. I'm going to introduce, like I mentioned, we have two speakers today. I'm going to go ahead and introduce them both. Our first speaker is Dr. Siegel. He's a nephrologist at the University of Michigan and is the Medical Review Board Chair for Midwest Kidney Network 11. Dr. Siegel today is going to discuss his recently published article describing ways that facilities which have high rates of fistulas despite having patients with many comorbid conditions. And joining him today is Maria Reiner. She is the Senior Director for the Upper Midwest Enterprise Dialysis Programs at Sanford Health. Sanford Health has 17 outpatient hemodialysis units and 6 home programs that are located in 4 different states in the Upper Midwest region. Ms. Reiner will discuss how she has empowered her nurses to evaluate fistulas and collaborate with the vascular surgeons to shorten the time that a patient has a catheter in. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the call over to Dr. Siegel.
Great. Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak today. If we go to the next slide. During the first half of our presentation, I'll start by discussing the importance of long-term catheter reduction. I'm going to talk about some recently published work that sheds light on the impact of comorbidities on creating a surgical access. Then we'll review some of the common barriers that dialysis facilities run into when trying to reduce their dependence on long-term catheters. And in the second half, Maria will walk us through the process that their health system went through so that you all can see an example of best practices in action. Go to the next slide. While I realize that there will always be some patients who need catheter-based dialysis, it's important not to become complacent with relying on catheters. And in this slide, we see some of the major adverse effects associated with long-term catheters. On the left side, all-cause mortality is 50% higher for patients with a catheter compared to patients with a fistula for access, as shown in the blue bar. Major cardiovascular events, shown in the middle, are 40% higher with a catheter, and the risk of fatal infections, seen on the right, twice as high with a catheter compared to a fistula. And even though we've had some success in reducing bloodstream infections through a variety of different mechanisms, we've not been able to reduce the infection risk with a catheter to that of infection risks with fistula or even a graft. Next slide. Sometimes we hear from facilities that have high catheter rates, and they say that their infection rates are quite low, so what's the big concern? Well, there's other problems that go along with long-term catheter use, such as mechanical complications. We see problems with fibrin sheaths that develop when the catheters have been in for a long time. That leads to longer treatment times, the need for TPA, sometimes catheter exchange. Ultimately, we work harder to get adequate dialysis for those patients. When catheters sit in a blood vessel, they can cause stenosis, and ultimately that can lead to thrombosis and DVT. Those patients sometimes get put on anticoagulation, opening them up to another set of potential complications. And there's long-term integrity issues with catheters. Every once in a while, we'll see problems with a catheter that develops cracking, a hole, problems with air embolisms, and once in a while there's catheters that just fall out. If we go to the next slide. Finally, long-term catheter rates are publicly reported on the Dialysis Facility Compare website. Here you can see the dialysis clinic where I see patients. Our catheter rate's 10% relative to the state and national averages of 11 and 13% respectively. Vascular access is also incorporated into the STAR rating system, which you can see in the middle section of the slide. And obviously, vascular access is part of the quality incentive program, and so it can have an impact on the facility Medicare payment. So let me stop here. I think we have a polling question up next.
That's correct. So let me just go ahead and pull up that polling question for the audience. I'm sending it out right now to everybody. I have our first polling question. Please indicate the most significant barrier in reducing long-term catheters in your facility. So I'll give it a little bit of time for everybody to answer that question. And they're starting to come on in. We've got quite a few already. And I'll just close it out here in 3, 2, and 1. And I'll send out the results. So question was, please indicate the most significant barrier in reducing long-term catheters in your facility. About 38% said we have too many new patients that are starting dialysis with a catheter. 7% says our patients have more comorbidities than average. 27% said our surgeons are the challenge. 19, we have patients who have exhausted all their vascular access, and about 8.3% said other issues. So kind of a good mix there. So let me get back to the slides and turn it back over to Dr. Siegel.
Okay, great, thanks. Well, that's interesting because when I talk with staff at different dialysis facilities that have relatively high catheter rates and low rates of fistula, one of the common sentiments that I often hear is that our patients are sicker. So I'm not sure, surprised or pleased that that was less of a response on today's poll. But that I think is a common sentiment in the community. And the problem is that not every dialysis facility can have patients that are sicker than average. But if it's true that dialysis facilities that have patients with more comorbidities have lower fistula rates, then we might expect to see some graded relationship such that facilities with healthier patients should have higher fistula rates and lower catheter rates. So we decided to test that hypothesis by evaluating patients who've been on dialysis for over a year, and we looked at the type of vascular access related to the number of comorbid conditions that they had. And then we rolled this up to the dialysis clinic level, and we looked at over 5,800 dialysis facilities in the country, which comprised over 300,000 Medicare patients. Next slide. And so in this figure, you see the 10 different comorbidities that have an impact on successful vascular access creation. Diabetes, heart disease, vascular disease, those lead the list, and we've divided all of the dialysis facilities into 5 groups based on the proportion of patients with any given condition. So at the far left, in our lowest grouping, are the facilities that have the healthiest patients. And as we move to the right, facilities have a higher proportion of their patients with the comorbidities listed. So I want to point out that at the extremes, in the first and 99th percentile, the far left and far right groups, those groups only have about 60 dialysis facilities in each one. It's the sickest and the healthiest facilities out there. In the medium group, in the middle of the graph, are about 3,500 dialysis clinics. So the vast majority of clinics fall into that medium category. And there's about 1,000 dialysis facilities in both the low and high groups. And the key point here is that even clinics with relatively healthy patients, shown on the left, still have relatively high prevalence of comorbidities like diabetes at 50%, heart disease at 40%, vascular disease in the 20 to 25% range. Next slide. So here we have the vascular access distribution among the different comorbidity groupings. And so what surprised me the most with these results is that in the high comorbidity group, the second from the right, the fistula rates are still above 60%, and the catheter rates are about 12%. The other interesting finding is that in the low and lowest groups on the far left, fistula rates aren't dramatically higher. They're 65 to 68%, and the catheter rates are just about 10%. So despite the range of comorbidities, the vascular access distribution between groups is strikingly similar. And it's only when we get to that highest comorbidity group, again about 60 facilities, that we see the fistula rates drop off and the catheter rates go up appreciably. Next slide. So the prior results were unadjusted at the facility level. In this analysis, we adjust for patient factors that we know are important in vascular access creation, so age, race, sex, ethnicity, body mass index. And after adjustment for that, we see even in those handful of facilities with the sickest patients, they're still able, on average, to achieve fistula rates above 60%. So when we look from left to right, healthiest to sickest, there's only a 6% difference in the fistula rates, from about 69% in those healthiest facilities down to 63% in facilities with the sickest patients. Now, what you don't see here is the amount of variation within a given group. So for a similar mix of patients, some facilities are able to achieve higher fistula rates than others. Clearly then, there's other important factors besides patient comorbidity that drive success. Next slide. So there are some small differences in average fistula use across facilities for the comorbidity groupings until we get to the very high or very low comorbidity rates are reached. And here's, I think, a striking statistic that for 70% of dialysis facilities in the U.S., variation in the comorbidity level accounts for less than 1% in the differences in their fistula rates. So, to me at least, facility practice patterns likely account for some of the variation in fistula use at any given level of comorbidity. Now, there's obviously other factors too, such as the surgeon, which will impact vascular access outcomes. And I'm going to talk about that in just a couple minutes. But before we move on, I do want to be clear that I'm not saying that at the individual level, an individual patient's comorbidities don't have an impact on their vascular access options. That is, we know that for any given individual, age, diabetes, other comorbidities, they do have a potential impact on the success of fistula surgery, but that's different than looking at the facility level as a whole. And so, to me, the bottom line, the our patients are sicker, doesn't appear to hold up when we look at vascular access at the clinic level. We go to the next slide. As we think about other root causes for long-term catheter use, I tend to group people into two different categories. There are those who are on track to have a surgical access created, but it takes longer than 90 days. And then there are those who are not on track, either because they have at some point fallen off the pathway, or occasionally where a fistula graft may not actually be the best access choice for them. I've listed only the tip of the iceberg here in terms of a few examples, but I'm going to try and touch on each one of them in the upcoming slides. I think it's important to remember first, though, that 70% of new patients are starting dialysis with a catheter, and that was a pretty common response that you all just gave in our polling. So if we go to the next slide, one potential solution to all the patients who are starting with a new catheter is don't put in a catheter to start. For patients that have known chronic kidney disease, where we're not thinking about renal recovery like an acute kidney injury, and where we think creating a fistula may actually be challenging, consider placing an immediate use graft. We're into probably the second or third generation of these immediate use grafts. The first couple generations had some problems with clotting and other surgical issues, but this iteration of them appears to be much more promising. And so it's worth having a conversation with the surgeons who do your vascular access to think about using these in carefully selected patients. And you might imagine a scenario where somebody comes in and rather than sending them for a tunnel catheter placement, you're able to get them in for one of these grafts. And if it's done in the forearm, there's always the possibility that down the road, that can be secondarily converted into an upper arm fistula in the future. So again, this isn't going to be a solution for everybody, but these grafts are showing some promise, and in the right circumstances, may help avoid putting a catheter in to begin with. Next slide. I think the other strategy for new patients who don't have a vascular access and are otherwise going to be catheter dependent is to think about peritoneal dialysis. And PD is really a potential solution for a number of different root causes. For new patients, PD can be done urgently with catheters used in the first couple days after placement. And yes, there's some risk for leaking when we do that, but if you keep the fill volumes low and the patient's done supine and moves right to the cycler therapy, this can typically be managed pretty well. We know that PD is underutilized overall, and we know that not all patients with kidney failure have adequate modality education. So this is a great opportunity to talk about PD as an alternative when patients are faced with a tunnel catheter. Another time when PD comes up is for patients who have been on dialysis for a long time, and they may have exhausted most or all of the surgical options for an access and often end up being labeled as catheter dependent. And so this is a great time to rethink PD. Even if in the past that patient had declined doing PD, people's situations change, and what may not have been a good option for them in the past may be more attractive now. So sometimes it's good to dig up PD as a potential solution in that situation as well. If we go to the next slide. I want to put in a plug for peer mentoring, since this can be a really powerful way of communicating with patients. And there are plenty of dialysis programs that have had significant success with engaging peer mentors to work with other patients who decline a surgical access. Sometimes as healthcare professionals, we can talk until we're blue in the face, but when similar words come from a patient who's walked in the shoes and lived that experience, it can mean all the difference in the world. And so I think sometimes these are underutilized resources. Next slide. I do want to take a minute and highlight the importance of collaborating with a good surgeon for access placement. There is substantial variation in the proportion of fistula created by surgeons as seen in the top graph. Overall, the median fistula placement rate of surgeons across the country is 71%. But there's some surgeons that have a much lower percentage on the left-hand side of that top graph, and there's some surgeons that have a much higher percentage on the right-hand side of that top graph. Not surprisingly, the more fistula that a surgeon places, the more likely they are to mature. And that's the bottom graph, where surgeons who place the most number of fistula have AVF that are almost 50% more likely to mature than those surgeons who place the least number of AVF. Now, overall, the maturation rate for fistula is about 60%, and it's important for patients to know that there's a chance that they'll need additional procedures, like a fistulogram, or even an additional surgery to have a usable access. Patients who aren't counseled on the failure rate may be more likely to refuse additional attempts in the future. So having the discussion on the front end before the patient goes to the operating room may prevent refusal of additional attempts for vascular access down the road. Next slide. I want to talk a little bit about exhausted vascular access. And so there may be some opportunities to open up closed veins that we have long considered abandoned. And this is images on the right-hand side from a patient that I cared for who had exhausted surgical access in both arms and both legs and was using a translumbar catheter for their vascular access. With some help from interventional radiology, they were able to recannulate the internal jugular vein, which is the balloon picture that's in the middle. And on the right-hand side, you can see the internal jugular vein open up with contrast flowing through it. And then in coordination with our surgeons, that patient was able to go to the operating room relatively quickly and have one of the hero devices placed, that hybrid graft catheter. And this has been 2-3 years since this was done. That access is still working, and that patient is catheter-free. Now, this typically requires advanced interventional radiology capability, so it's not going to be available everywhere for everyone, and it requires a lot of coordination between providers, radiologists, the surgeons, and whatnot. But in some circumstances, it may be a viable option for people where we think they have exhausted all of their options. Next slide. So in the end, change is hard, but it's not impossible, and it's helpful when there is an engaged nephrologist who helps dialysis facility staff to be empowered to work with patients and achieve better vascular access outcomes. It requires partnering with surgeons and the vascular access team, and it requires good communication all the way around. So with that, I want to turn things over to Maria, who's going to discuss how their dialysis program changed how they think about vascular access.
Thank you much, Dr. Siegel. And as he said in this last screen, that culture change really does take a team. And that's what we really found in our improvement project that we started back in 2015. We had seen that a lot of our dialysis units had somewhere less than 55% of their patients that had AV fistulas. We had upwards of 20% of patients with catheters greater than 90 days, and it was going to affect our quality as well as our payment related to the QIP scores. So we wanted to make a change, and that's where this all started. So if you want to go on to the next screen. The next slide shows you a little bit about Sanford Health, but what I really wanted to show you was the fact that we have dialysis units that are very rural. We have 17 units across 4 different states, and because of that, we have some small dialysis units in some locations as well as some larger dialysis units. And so we do have the challenge of what to do with those patients who might live up to 150 miles away from their surgeon's office. Next slide, please. So in 2015, we decided not to take the whole enterprise on at one time. We started out with one of our larger dialysis units in Fargo, North Dakota. And you can see in 2015 what our average percent of fistula rates was. It was right around 55%, and our goal was to try to achieve something greater than 65%. We were running upwards of greater than 15% of our patients that had catheters greater than 90 days. At first, we were going to take on the project as a BSI, catheter-related BSI project, but after we discussed that with the team further, we decided that we really needed to get our percent of catheters in greater than 90 days under control before we wanted to take on the BSI thing, because we felt that would be a natural evolution for our BSI rates to go down if we had less catheters. And Stephanie, do you have a poll to do right now?
I do, so thank you, Maria. So we do have our second polling question. Let me just give me a minute to pull that up. Okay, let me send it on out to the audience. And it should be out to the audience, so we'll just give everybody about a minute to answer it and start getting some of the questions back. Which of the following does your facility use to decrease long-term catheters? And we've gotten quite a few responses back. And I'll just leave it open just for a little bit longer. There's still some responses coming in, so. All right, I'll close this survey in 3, 2, and 1. And I will send out the results to the audience. Well, to the answers to the question, which of the following does your facility use to decrease long-term catheters, we had around almost 13% said they do root cause analysis. 75% have vascular access tracking tools. 14% said they have the expert cannulator program. About 5% do quarterly vascular access meeting. Only 1% said they don't do anything, and about 4% say they do others. So let me close this out. And okay, Maria, back to you now.
Thank you. So to start our project, we sat the entire team down in this particular dialysis unit and did a root cause analysis. And we looked at 4 different aspects of what could be causing the issue of too many catheters in our dialysis unit. And there were a few things that we found. One issue that was very relevant was the fact that the caregivers in the unit were busy doing dialysis. They weren't following up with patients. Patients may have had an appointment for their vein mapping and or their surgery and they didn't show up. They may have may have been admitted without having access in place. There might have been quite a few different scenarios that were playing out there, but our caregivers were quite busy. They weren't thinking about that as being a priority, so that was left to chance that when patients were getting in to get an access placed. From patient perspectives, we did feel that there was quite a few times where we probably could have done a lot better education. We had many patients who were refusing vascular access procedures. Some of that related to just inadequate education about what it meant and what complications that they could have as a result of having that catheter in place. In looking at it and talking with the nephrologists about what they were seeing is they were relying on the nurses to follow up with them when patients needed to have a fistula placed, and as I spoke before, the caregivers weren't always paying attention to that. So nobody was really steering the ship, to say it mildly, with regards to who was taking care of that fistula placement. When we talked with the surgeon, and I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about that, they were not aware that we needed to even have fistulas in by a certain time frame, and they had no idea what our facility expectations were. So when we placed a call to them to make an appointment to have a referral for a fistula to be placed, they just did it whenever their schedule was available to do that. Next slide, please. So the first thing that we did was we took we took one of our nephrologists, our lead nephrologist, and a couple nursing staff, and we went over and met with the vascular surgery department. It included the surgeons, it included the receptionists, it also included radiology, who was doing the vein mapping, and the clinic directors. And we sat down, and the first question that came out of one of the surgeons' mouth was, gave me a little bit of an aha moment, because he says, well, what are your expectations? What do you want from us? And it was that question really kind of led us into a wonderful conversation about what our needs were for our patient population. That we needed, we had many patients that were coming to dialysis without any type of access in place, so it resulted in having a catheter placed. That we needed to try to have that fistula in, it matured, and ready to go before 90 days so that we didn't take the hit on our quality scores. And so after we discussed that with them, they had a lot of ideas about what we could do together. Next slide, please. So we developed a completely new workflow. And the surgeons and the nephrologists and the dialysis staff all agreed to this workflow. So basically, whenever a patient was admitted to a dialysis unit, the decision was that very first treatment, that assessment was made that the patient did not have a fistula placed. The charge nurse in the facility would call and make a referral to surgery for that. The nephrologist was responsible for making sure that there was an order in the order set for that referral to surgery. And that, like I say, on the admission day of that patient, that appointment was made. Within week 1, we completed surgery. And so in part of that process of getting that patient in and the surgeons completing that, we had to have a commitment on their side that they would give that referral to whatever physician was available to do it in that very first week. As well, we needed the commitment from the receptionist in the vascular clinic office to make sure that they knew that they would have to make that appointment and make those decisions at the front end of making that appointment. After the surgery was completed, the dialysis staff were going to monitor that post-surgical site and the maturation of it to assure that infection didn't happen and that it was maturing appropriately. All surgeons in this particular office wanted the surgical recheck appointment at week 4. And then thereafter, again, the dialysis staff and the nephrologists continued to monitor that fistula on a weekly basis. If they felt it was not maturing or that it might require a transposition, they referred that patient back to the surgeon's office before week 10 to have it looked at. Some of our surgeons wanted to see that patient back for a second surgical site visit. Not all of them did. And by week 10, the nephrologist physician had been monitoring this catheter and usage as well as the fistula maturation. And so he or she would provide another order for us to begin using that in the dialysis unit. So in the last 2 weeks, we started cannulation processes, and by the end of week 12, which would be that 90-day time period, we had an appointment made for that tunnel catheter removal. If you want to go on to the next slide. One of the things that we did was to develop a 3-in-1 appointment, is what we call it. Prior to this workflow being made, the patients would go in for a pre-surgical appointment, and then they would go back and get vein mapping done, and then after those 2 things were completed, they would set up surgery. As I showed you in that very first slide, we come from a very large rural area. So this was very difficult for some of our patients to be making multiple trips to a surgeon's office. So our surgeons decided on the 3-in-1 appointment. The patients will be set up for that appointment. We tell them it's an all-day appointment. They go in the morning, NPO. they see the surgeon who does their assessment and their H&P. They are set up at the same time for vein mapping, and then they will go to the surgical suite and have their fistula created. Next slide, please. Another thing that we work together is to develop a tool for dialysis staff. We made it in an Excel file, and as you can see up there in the corner, the patient's name would be put in there. And this first date that's in there, this admission date, or we would put that date in there, and we developed this tool so it would automatically calculate what dates different things needed to be completed by. So it became a roadmap for the staff to be able to monitor if things were getting done when they should get done. The second row on the underneath there actually was the date that things actually happened, and this allowed the staff to monitor what was happening and that if things were getting done at the right time. The group used this tool pretty extensively, and I'll talk a little bit more in a later slide about how we use this tool. But they continue to use this tool to monitor that roadmap and so that we make sure that we get those catheters out within 90 days. Next slide, please. So there were a few other components that were part of this whole process that made this successful. At the time, I was reading a book called The 4 Disciplines of Execution, and it's a wonderful book if you haven't had a chance to look at it. But it's actually a performance improvement process. And in it, it was a wildly important goal, is what it's called. And one of the things that it talks about in this book is to let go of the whirlwind around you and spend time on quality improvement measures and put all of your focus on that one single quality improvement measure. So we developed what we call this wildly important goal meeting. Once a week, the group would come together and they would bring this tool that we had just created, and all the patients would be on there, and we'd talk about where every patient was at, who's doing what with those patients, are they meeting the goals, are they not meeting the goals, things such as, I called the receptionist didn't set up the appointment within that first week. That would immediately prompt one of us to call the clinic director and say this did not get set up timely. She would go out and make the change. And so there was this constant re-education of the receptionist staff in the vascular clinic office. We also had an expert cannulator program. This was probably one of the most difficult things because everyone wants to believe they're an expert cannulator, but we took a small handful of the best cannulators that worked full-time, and we decided to utilize those individuals for all of those first 6 cannulations of a new fistula. These people had very low incident rates of infiltrations and those types of things. So we felt that it was important that we always maintained the best cannulators so that it didn't slow down our process at all. We also made a major policy change. In the past, we used to start everybody with all new fistulas with a 17-gauge needle and then reduce it to a 16-gauge needle for a couple weeks and then go to a 15-gauge. Well, if we're going to do this within 90 days, we could no longer do that. We allowed that expert cannulator to assess that fistula and determine which size of needle they felt that they could cannulate best with. And generally speaking, we rarely use a 17-gauge needle anymore. Most of them are 16 and 15-gauge starts with. The other thing, as I mentioned, that we do all vascular clinic outlier follow-ups. So if there's a new receptionist that comes on and wants to schedule that out for 3 weeks, or they don't schedule the vein mapping with it, we make sure that they are that information is back to that clinic so that they can do their quality improvement and following up with why things didn't happen the way that they were expected to. Another aspect of this was we held quarterly vascular access meetings over our noon hour, and we worked with the nephrologists and the surgeons. We brought all of the patients who had fistulas placed in that past quarter. If there were any outstanding issues with patients that we saw, and that was where we began some of our discussions about transposition, and ultimately out of that group came the idea to begin using some of those other types of fistulas, the ellipsis and those types of products. So that one, we have since ceased using this particular meeting because we really kind of ran out of things to talk about because our rates are doing so much better. Next slide, please. So here's where we're at. So in 2015, as you remember, we were well over 15% patients with catheters in greater than 90 days. 2016 was really when we put everything into place and, learned from our lessons and implemented everything. And by 2017, we have been able to sustain CVC rates greater than 90 days for over 3 years at this point in time. Next slide, please. As well, our fistula rates have gone up over the years. As you can see, we started there less than 55% in 2015, and we've been able to sustain a growth of fistula rates up over 70 percentile for the last couple years. Next slide, please. So this one really talks about where we're trying to spread the practices. What I showed you was we started with one dialysis unit in Fargo, North Dakota. We have spread some of those practices to all of our other sites. We are currently working on some sites in our South Dakota region where we're struggling with it and developing some of the practices that we used in the northern regions that were very successful. So we're utilizing some of the lessons learned, but I think the key principles that we found here was that relationship that was built with the surgeon's office. And I do want to mention that fact that this was not only Sanford surgeon offices that we went to. We actually visited some competitive hospitals where some of our patients were going and having their accesses placed. So it was really reaching out, sitting down and talking with those surgeons, because those surgeons really do want to do a good job and have very successful outcomes. And so partnering with those surgical office practices was key in this. The one other thing I forgot to mention was we no longer have our WIG meetings on a weekly basis, but we have put all of our fistula rates and our tunnel catheters that are in there. We talk about those on a routine basis in a daily huddle. And so if there's any patients that are new that are being cannulated or need attention to their catheters, that's where that's discussed. Next slide, please. And at this point, we could take any questions or discussion that you might have.
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Siegel and Maria. We do have some questions that have come in during the presentation, so I will jump right into some. And I think this is for Dr. Siegel. We are seeing here that surgeons are starting to put the first access in the wrist. When that fails, they then go on to the upper arm. Is this a new best demonstrated practice?
Typically, I think the mantra for the surgeons is to start distally on the arm, which would be the wrist, or even down in the snuff box at the base of the thumb, and then to work more proximally to the upper arm. And that's because you can't go backwards. So once you start working in the upper arm, if you do a brachiocephalic fistula or brachiobasilic fistula, you can't go back and use any of the veins in the forearm. So with a wrist fistula, although the success rate may be a bit lower, the morbidity and complication rate is actually quite low. And so oftentimes the surgeons will explore at the wrist as their first opportunity. And if they can get an access in and it works, then great. And if not, they move higher up the arm. So that's pretty standard practice, I think, in a lot of areas.
Great, thank you. This also question is for you, Doctor. Does Medicare cover those AVG options? I'm thinking those other types of grafts.
Like the Hero device. Yeah,
Yeah.
there is. There are some differences. I know I've heard surgeons discuss that the reimbursement rates for some of these access procedures are not necessarily proportional to the amount of effort or skill that goes into them. And so, in the past, for example, creating an upper arm fistula, like with the basilic vein, can be a much more complicated procedure and require more skill, and that would reimburse for less than, for example, putting in a prosthetic graft. So there are some differences in reimbursement, but my understanding is that all of those access options are covered by Medicare, so there shouldn't be insurance barriers to different access types.
Great, thank you. Here's a question for you again. I just wonder, would it be more effective if the planning starts in the hospital? Is it possible that as soon as there's a patient who will have a CVC, there should automatically already be an AVF or PD catheter plan prior to discharge from hospital?
Yeah, that would be great, and even backing it up a step further, obviously the goal would be to do a lot of this planning when patients have chronic kidney disease and their GFR is, around 20 or in the upper teens, where we're engaging in modality education at that point, and then moving forward with access plans when dialysis seems like it's more imminent. That obviously involves engagement from the nephrologist because those activities need to happen outside of the dialysis facility. And so it requires having a robust modality education process that kicks in for patients with chronic kidney disease when their GFR is between 20 and 30, and then access planning that ensues after that. For patients who have chronic kidney disease, develop acute kidney injury, need to start dialysis more urgently than people may have anticipated, I think absolutely trying to have some of those discussions in the hospital and to see what can be set up. There are some issues with surgeon reimbursement for placing a vascular access while a patient's hospitalized, particularly for another reason. And so sometimes there's reluctance from surgeons to put a fistula or graft in before the patient leaves the hospital, but it's not impossible, and it probably takes some higher level discussion between nephrology and surgery to decide under what circumstances is that going to be most useful to do. But I think the short answer to the question is absolutely, as much as can be done in the hospital will help streamline and expedite things when the patient ultimately is in the dialysis facility.
Right. This question might just be for both of you, a little bit of a comment, a little bit of question. We're having problems with insurance coverage of patients, either with a vascular access surgeon not covered or the patient is unfunded. How can we resolve that in a timely manner? Majority of the time, the vascular access surgeon won't place a permanent access on a patient while they're in the hospital because they said they won't get paid for doing so. Those are one of our barriers. So any comments on that from either Marie or Dr. Siegel?
Well, I can tell you that is a real life reality for the hospitals, and oftentimes, especially if they aren't associated with your dialysis units, they may choose to not do that. So, and that was one of the reasons why we felt it was important to start that process on the first day they were admitted to a dialysis unit to get them back in, because the hospitals didn't want to take on a non-payable procedures.
Right. Okay, great. Here's a question. Let's see. Dr. Siegel, they're asking if they could have the article that you were referring to, that probably you wrote, that you co-authored or authored.
Sure, I can send you the reference and the link for that. Yes.
Okay, perfect. And then when I send out all these other materials, the slide decks and things will be sent out in about 10 business days. I will attach that also. So for that, everybody participating today would get a copy of that or a link to it. That'd be great. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay. And again, this might be for both of you. How do you deal with surgeons when you are not in an area that has a large medical center with vascular departments and nephrologist preferences for referring patients?
So Marie, go ahead.
Well, we did deal with that somewhat. It really took a lot of work to break down some of those barriers. I don't have the magic bullet for that by any means, but I can tell you that face-to-face meetings are a wonderful thing, because if you keep the focus on the patient and the patient need, and not on why you want it for the dialysis facility per se, it becomes more of a different type of conversation. Like I say, the physicians are wonderful people who want to do a great job, and if the focus is on this is what is best for this patient, they are at this level of risk having that catheter in, and we don't want them to get a BSI. So, if you keep that focus on that, they come around in that discussion that we have with them, and that was kind of the key thing that we found when we were talking with those offices.
And I'll just add, and to underscore the importance of having a face-to-face meeting. So this is an opportunity for the medical director of the clinic, nurse manager, other key stakeholders to sit down and meet with the surgeons, because oftentimes, and I think it sounds like, Maria, this was the case in your situation, oftentimes the surgeons are unaware of either their own access outcomes, they may be unaware of the issues that the dialysis unit is grappling with, and so it's a time for both some education for the surgeons and talk with them about the issues that you're facing. It's also, as you probably realize, surgeons can be, like other physicians, can be a very competitive group, and so sometimes a little getting it out there that, there's other surgeons we understand that do X, Y, and Z, and we're wondering if that's possible for you to do it. Sometimes inducing a little competition, even if you're in a more rural or isolated area, just to let them know what's going on in the rest of the world can sometimes really help, because nobody wants to feel left out or like they're underperforming, no matter what they're doing.
Great, thank you. There was a question here, would Maria be willing to share her tracking tool? Is that
Definitely.
Something, Maria, you can do? Okay. Again, If you send it to me, I would be glad to share it out to the audience.
Okay.
Another question for Maria. It says, with the master cannulator practice, did I hear you say you're no longer using 17-gauge needles?
Right. So when we put this into place, our policy prior to this project was that we did 17-gauge needles for a week, and then we'd go to 16 for a couple weeks, and then we'd go to 15. So our new practice is that the expert cannulators who have done a lot of cannulation and are very successful at it make the assessment as to what size of needle that they need. In a majority of new fistulas, they do not feel that they need the 17 gauge, and often we'll start with a 16 gauge. So we use very few unless we feel that they're very small fistulas. Now, we won't. If you remember in that timeline, we only had a couple weeks of cannulation before we take that tunnel catheter out. So we really wanted to make sure we had good cannulations with the larger needles and that we were getting adequate blood flow during the dialysis process. So if the fistula could receive a 15 gauge or a 16 gauge, that's what's put in first.
Great, thank you. For Dr. Siegel, any data on the success of the, I hope I say this right, the WaveLink endo-AVF system?
Oh, yeah. So things that are coming in that are on the horizon or are starting to come in practice. So I think they're referring to endovascular fistula creation. So rather than cutting through the skin, this is done in the procedure suite. And I think the data is still early, but initial results look promising, and this may open up vascular access options for people where a traditional approach may not be possible. And so I'm not super familiar with all the data. Early results look promising. I definitely think that, and there's only a few centers I think in the country that are doing it right now, but definitely something to be on the lookout for in the upcoming years.
We are utilizing actually both of those Not all fistulas, but we are utilizing them. And one of the things that I would make sure that, as a dialysis clinic, make sure that you get some education on the front end for the staff who are doing those cannulations, because the surgeons started putting them in without our staff understanding them well, and we struggled a bit at first. So I would recommend strong education up front before those cannulations occur with those new types of accesses. But they work wonderful. We have not really had a whole lot of issue with them, and we've been very happy with the outcomes so far.
Perfect, thank you. I think we might have time for another question here or two. I do have a couple requests for Maria about your tracking tool, so we will get that out. This is for Dr. Siegel. It says, I have a surgeon who creates an access in a two-step process, creates the AVF in surgery, then brings back at a later date to raise it. This seems to take a lot longer to transition over. Is this a new trend in access creation?
Right. So typically this is done for upper arm basilic vein fistulas, and the issue is that the basilic vein is deep, and so often not only do they need to connect that vein to the artery as the first step to create the fistula, but it needs to be raised up to the surface. And some surgeons do this as a single-stage procedure. The problem is that they're manipulating a vein that is, when they do it in one stage, it's that the surgeons are manipulating a vein that is thin and fragile, and it's a large surgery to do the transposition part of things. If the fistula ultimately fails before it's ever used, it has primary failure, that patient's gone through a really big surgery and doesn't have anything to show for it. So many surgeons are finding that doing it in two stages means that the first surgery up front is lower risk with lower morbidity in terms of complications, and when they go to elevate the vein later, it's much easier for them to work with, and so the outcomes may be a bit better. The thing that's important to remember is that after that vein has been elevated, it's essentially a mature fistula. And so if those fistula may be able to be cannulated soon after the elevation. And so you really mostly have to just wait for the incision to heal up a bit, some of the swelling to go down, and depending on the timing, may be able to use those fistula not too much longer than if it were done in a single-stage procedure.
Great, thank you so much. And I think, well, we had a lot of good questions, a lot of good dialogue. I want to thank Dr. Siegel and Maria Rayner for joining us today. I just want to wrap up here and make sure I get everybody out here on time as promised. I do want to hear from you, from facilities out there like Maria, who have best practices they want to share on any future BSI LAN meetings that we have for this year. Please notify the NCC if you're interested in presenting in a future LAN meeting. We would love to have you. You can also follow the NCC on Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube. And very important, the evaluation procedure has changed for this year. Instead of the survey link popping up at the end of this meeting, you will be receiving it in the email that you registered with. It should be coming approximately about 4:15 Eastern Standard Time. It should be emailed directly to you. It will have the link for the survey. You can also right now click on the link that's on your screen, and it will connect you to the Survey Monkey, which then when you complete, you will in turn be able to get your CEUs. As always, if you have any problems and don't receive the email, contact the NCC at nccinfo@hsag.com. And with that, I think we are just again thanking everybody for taking time out of their day to join us. And thank you to our speakers today. It was a great presentation. I hope everybody took away a lot of best promising practices and able to implement something in their facility to help reduce the BSI and reduce the long-term catheter rates. Thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you, Dr. Siegel and Maria. Bye-bye.